I'm going to turn this over to Roberta, and we're going to really dig into the research context and methodology.
Thanks, Cassie. I appreciate that. So, as I'm sure just by the interest in this webinar, our concern is a shared concern across the country around the disconnect that we were noticing where employers in rural communities were screaming for the need of employees. You know, businesses are shutting down early in the evening. You sometimes might be on a road trip and you can't get your Tim Hortons after 7 o'clock at night because there just isn't staff in the rural communities. And yet, on the other hand, through our community service providers, we knew that there were a huge number of people who were still looking for work in those communities. And so there seemed to be a disconnect between who employers were hiring, their struggle to find and keep what they were calling, in quotation marks, good workers. They were experiencing high turnover. They were needing to respond just to the shifting trends in the workplace, maybe more automation. Small rural businesses often can't afford the big changes in infrastructure. And then we were concerned about the individuals, the diverse individuals. So in many of the rural communities, those would be members of Indigenous communities, but also people with diverse abilities, as Janet mentioned in the intro, but also people who maybe had other types of differences that weren't really accepted within their communities. So there might be members of the LGBTQ2S community. There might be people from different cultural backgrounds, people with different religious beliefs. And so the folks that were different than the mainstream in those communities were somehow being left out. And we originally were using language in our proposal around non-traditional employees in that workplace. And then we realized that traditional or non-traditional is used in such a variety of ways. It wasn't the best term. So through our focus groups and our advisory groups, we landed on underrepresented. Whoever is represented in the community, but not so much in the local workplaces are the folks that we were interested in working with. And then we also worked with the community service providers. So we recognize that many of them are struggling with limited resources, very often because of the population of the community. There isn't a lot of staff assigned, and yet the workload in some ways is tougher. And the complex needs that they were dealing with were really challenging, and particularly challenging in a time of rapid change. So that was what sort of set us to do this research. And Peter from Free Rein approached us at Life Strategies and said, how can we do this together? It's something that Peter and I for a long time had been looking for a project to work on together, and this just seemed to be a really good fit. So our goals, our stated research goals, were using the Skills for Success model. So some of you will be familiar with Skills for Success. It's the newer version of what was the essential skills, but recognizing that there's some foundational skills that everybody can benefit from if they're going to succeed in the workplace. So we wanted to, and we got some funding related to this, wanted to see how the Skills for Success model could be used to bridge that disconnect between the employers and those underrepresented employees. We wanted to see how understanding the Skills for Success could help both the employers and the underrepresented employees to hold on to the employment commitments, partnerships that they had. Remember, employers were saying one of their problems was this churn of employees. So just like individuals want to keep their jobs, employers want to keep the folks that they've hired. And they want to help those employees, and the employees themselves want to be productive participants in the labor force. And so then another goal of the research was to identify better ways for employers to support those underrepresented employees and to help them together maintain employment. So when we were looking at this research, we had to think about, well, how would we go about doing something about it? How would we begin to do this research? So we developed a 5-phase approach. We started, as we start most of our projects, with an environmental scan and consultation and forming an advisory group of employers and representatives of those rural communities. We staffed our project intentionally with people that were themselves representatives of the underrepresented groups. So we figured if we were doing research on the diversity disconnect in the rural communities, we ought to include the voices in a very active way. And it was such a joy to have the research participant or the research assistants that we hired that themselves were members of these underrepresented groups. And it made such a difference in the research because, of course, their faces and their voices really resonated with the folks that we were trying to reach and really helped employers understand in a new way the potential of hiring those workers. We then went through a data collection phase that carried on through forest fire season last summer, which of course impacts rural and remote communities, and some of them we couldn't even get into because the roads were closed. Through the data collection phase, we began a process of analysis and coming up with recommendations that we'll be sharing with you later. And then, of course, we moved on to dissemination, which is where we are right now in sharing these results with you all across the country. So I'll hand it back to Cassie to talk a little bit about the research design that we chose to use.
Thanks, Roberta. Yeah, and I think as part of the dissemination process, a lot of research just kind of ends when we write a report and it goes out there. And I think thanks Janet for sharing the executive summary, because the full research report itself is quite extensive and very long. And so, not everyone is going to have the interest or, time to read that full report. So we really did want to provide some shortened versions of reporting out information to support that dissemination. But also when we're looking at dissemination, we don't want it to just be like a one-way us telling you what the results are. And I know we're going to start there, but we really want to invite people to be actively engaging in the recommendations that we're going to go through later on in the session. So in terms of the research design, we used a multi-method approach, and that really comprised of two big approaches. So one was a survey that was done online, and the other was focus groups. And, working in rural and remote communities, of course, there is a bit of a challenge, especially with small businesses, to bring focus groups together in a timely manner and to make it easy for people who are busy to engage in conversations with us. So we shifted and included interviews, one-on-one interviews as well. So we did do some focus groups and we did some interviews to gather information about what was working with finding and maintaining employment for individuals, for employers, and also for community service providers. And then we also, on the survey, we had both qualitative and quantitative information that we were looking for. And we wanted to drum up a little more interest in the survey itself. And the survey was quite long. So we had a shortened postcard version that we sent out to the group as well to try to capture as much information as we can from the groups that we were looking at. We had 120 survey responses. And we ended up with 16 interviews from individuals, 11 workplaces, 7 community representatives, in addition to 3 additional focus groups. So we had a wide variety of perspectives. And those came across of 5 communities in the Fraser Valley region of BC. So we were looking at rural and remote communities. We looked at Agassiz, Ashcroft, Hope, Merritt, and Princeton. And as Roberta mentioned, this was in the midst of fire season. So one of those communities was on at least an evacuation alert for the majority of our data collection phase. And so that was really challenging to ensure that we could get out there into those communities, because one of the things that was really important was that participant outreach. We weren't just sending out emails, although that certainly is where we started, but we had our research assistants going into the community, walking around, meeting people, being visible, and going to spaces like Indigenous, First Nations band offices, introducing themselves, and maybe not necessarily asking for them to participate in the research right away, but introducing themselves, introducing Free Rein, and just trying to start having some sort of conversation or building community within those spaces. And so there really was a dedicated outreach for Indigenous groups, but also for groups that maybe had different levels of functioning. Maybe that would be accessibility issues in terms of physical accessibility or mobility, but also trying to look at neurodivergent ways of thinking. And so where are we going to find people like that? And how are we going to ensure that we can gather stories from them in respectful ways? And so that's why it was so important to have representation on our team, because they really did influence those outreach perspectives. And then the multiple perspectives. So that was either job seekers or individuals, some level of diversity there, recognizing that often diversity is not just one little tick box. There's lots of different factors that work together to make people, to give them a sense about who they are. And so intersectionality really came to play here. We looked at employers, and knowing that in small and rural places, employers themselves could be representatives of diverse groups in addition. And then the community representatives, maybe those are service providers working with unemployed individuals, maybe those are other representatives from the community. We really were trying to take a broad perspective here to gather stories across many different ideas. We're trying to gather as much as we can in those multiple perspectives. So in terms of the results, I'm actually going to start out with another Menti here. I'm going to ask you one of the questions that we asked, or a very similar question that we asked on our survey. When I look around my community, the businesses or organizations adequately represent its diversity. Would you agree with this statement? Where would you go? So the answer options you have are strongly disagree, disagree, neutral, agree, and strongly agree. So you can keep responding to that, but I'm going to move us forward. These are not necessarily surprising results. We had similar results. So in the survey, depending on whether you were a job seeker, a currently employed individual, or an employer, the question wording was just slightly different. But what we were looking at here was that representation. So does your community, or is your community reflected in the diversity of the workplaces that are there? And when we ask job seekers, if you take the responses from the left side there, so the strongly disagree and, or sorry, the 5 and the 45, so 49% of respondents said that they either agreed or strongly agreed that when they look at employers in their area, the workforce or staff represent the diversity of the community. So that's just under 50% saying that there was good representation in their community. When we look at employers, they had a much more favorable sense about the representation of their business. So it's the 16 and the 56. If we add those together, it's 82% strongly agreed or agreed that their business adequately represented the diversity of their community. So this was one of the key disconnects that we found, was that job seekers who were looking to be employed in their community weren't necessarily seeing as much diversity reflected in the employers in their area, but employers thought that they did reflect the diversity of their area. And that was one of the, yeah.
Cassie, I'll just jump in there as well, because it also really spoke to the invisibility of some of the diversity. So when we were talking to individuals and intentionally reached out to those individuals, sometimes they weren't seen as having diverse abilities by employers, because we would hear things. I was on site in the rural communities, and we would hear things from employers like, oh, there's nobody like that here. or we tried to have a committee and nobody applied. And so we just don't think that's a problem here. And so part of that disconnect is just we don't know what we don't know. And, you know, if people aren't coming into the shops or into the businesses, they don't even know the challenges that are being faced by people in the community.
Yeah. Or having the assumption that the layer of accommodations that they've offered are sufficient to invite that diversity, that people would feel welcomed to be in that space, I think is an important idea as well. So I'm going to ask another question to the group, very similar to our survey. So essentially what we gave them was a whole bunch of different options from the career decision making all the way through to finding a job to exiting gracefully out of the job. So this would kind of follow the full almost employee life cycle. And we had them rank essentially what were the easiest or most challenging activities that would fall on this employee life cycle. So someone coming in and finding work, through maintaining that work, and then exiting out of that work. And so I'm going to ask you to just reflect on your own career journey, and you'll have the ability to tag up to 3. And we're wondering what would be the most difficult in your own career journey. So right now I'm seeing kind of 3 big clusters on the very initial thing about deciding on a career direction. What is it that you want to do? What kind of path might you want to follow? The second cluster I'm seeing is finding job opportunities within your community. And the third cluster I'm seeing is obtaining advancement opportunities. So figuring out what you want to do, finding a place to do it, and thriving and growing maybe in that place, or developing your skills to bring those elsewhere.
And one that's coming in fourth is feeling welcomed and valued within the existing workplace environment. And that's always challenging, isn't it? When you don't see yourself represented there, when you're the first.
Yeah. And that's really what our participants found as well, when we were looking at the disconnect between what was easy and difficult for people in terms of employment tasks. When we looked at them across job seekers, people who were currently employed versus employers, well, employers told us that providing a welcoming space within the existing work environment was really easy. They put that as one of their top 3 easiest tasks. But when we look at job seekers and the top 3 most difficult tasks, they actually found that feeling welcome or valued in an existing workplace was really, really difficult. So employers thought that it was something easy to do, but job seekers were like, it's really, really hard. Whatever employers were doing in order to provide a welcoming space in the existing environment, it wasn't quite meeting the needs. And it's just going back to what Roberta shared on a few slides ago. When you don't see yourself represented, like just that representation can be really impacting the notion of feeling valued within an existing workplace. So the next slide I want to share before we move on from results is just a quick bit of information about how the skills for success related to finding employment and maintaining employment. So we're asking people to rate how important these all of the 9 skills for success were. And it's not surprising that across all of the stakeholder groups, so whether you were a job seeker or you were currently employed or you were an employer, and whether it was finding employment or maintaining employment, communication was key. That came out across the board as the most important thing. And what people meant by communication, I think that meant different things when we went into the interviews and the focus groups, and we'll talk about that a little bit. But having effective communication is going to be a top skill and something that we're going to need to focus on for our job seekers, helping staff who are currently employed, but also helping employers as well. And the other 2 that I want to highlight that came up on both sides were adaptability and collaboration. And those things kind of ebbed and flowed. And, I wonder, it's only been a few months since we wrapped up this research, but I wonder if we did this now, where adaptability might fall when we're looking at finding and maintaining employment. The landscape of employment has really shifted, and the tone for diversity, equity, inclusion has shifted. And so there could be some opportunities here to see where that might have gone. But the key I want you to take from these top skills is how important everybody thought communication was.
And when we see some of the factors that came out of the research, you'll understand how communication sort of weaves through many of them.